A warning: this video contains graphic descriptions and may not be suitable for all viewers. In early December 1927, an unusual gathering took place at a small farm just outside the small Texas town of Farwell. The farm owner, a 38-year-old man, had made the decision to sell most of his family's belongings. This was in preparation for his upcoming move to Blair, Oklahoma, where he would reunite with his wife and children. As the auction commenced, an incident occurred that would prove to be the catalyst for a series of shocking discoveries. A small wooden wagon inadvertently rolled over what appeared to be a small sinkhole. Little did the townspeople realize that this seemingly harmless incident would set in motion a chain of unsettling events. But before we embark on this disturbing tale, we kindly ask for your support. If you're a fan of true crime stories or are new to our content, we'd love it if you could show your appreciation by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and enabling all notifications. So, without further ado, let's plunge into the captivating narrative that unfolded before the horrified eyes of those involved. George Hassell was born in Smithville, Texas, in 1888 and was the youngest of 7 children. From the outset, his life was fraught with challenges, and his early years were marked by a tumultuous existence. Trapped in an oppressive household, George Hassell and his family endured the torment inflicted by his father, a relentless abuser. The violent nature of his father cast a shadow of fear and suffering over their lives, making each day an arduous battle for George, his mother, and his siblings. The constant presence of abuse created an environment of profound difficulty, leaving a lasting impact on their collective well-being. In 1901, when George was only 13, his father had allegedly beaten his mother to death and remarried shortly thereafter. In the year 1905, George's father passed away unexpectedly. Gripped by a conviction that his stepmother had administered a fatal dose of poison to his father, George was overcome with an initial surge of murderous thoughts. However, he managed to resist acting upon them. After enduring the traumatic circumstances at home, George took a decisive step and ran away, embarking on a life as a drifter. With a restless spirit, he struggled to maintain steady employment, often resorting to theft from both his employers and customers, creating a pattern of instability. Not only was George's personal life marred by his entanglement in the justice system, but his romantic relationships also suffered. At the age of 18, George found himself deeply smitten by a young woman in Buffalo Gap, Taylor County, Texas. They exchanged vows in December of 1909 and subsequently settled in Abilene, Texas. However, their journey together led them to Fort Worth, where George took up a position as a night watchman before eventually relocating to a farm near Hobart, Oklahoma. While he ventured to Oklahoma, George sent his wife and their infant son to Winters, Texas, with a vow to write to each other every day. He kept his end of the promise and wrote diligently, but a whole week went by before he received any word from his wife. When he finally did receive a letter, it shattered him. It declared that she was finished with him. This devastated him. Distraught and seeking solace, George enlisted in the army, only to desert his post and assume a new identity so that he could join the Navy. However, his actions did not go unnoticed, and he was apprehended, leading to a period of incarceration in a military prison. Time and time again, George made attempts to return to Texas, fueled by the hope of reuniting with his wife and child. During one such period, he even entered into marriage with another woman, solely because her son bore a striking resemblance to his own. Ultimately, he admitted defeat after enduring rejection from his wife, who drove him away from their home, while their son resorted to hurling rocks at him. Despite his yearning for companionship, and experiencing a series of 4 failed marriages, George could never extinguish the love he held for his first wife. Known for his bawdy behavior, heavy drinking, and an eye for the ladies, George's volatile temperament further complicated matters. Each union crumbled under the weight of his tumultuous lifestyle, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and shattered dreams. In 1917, George, who was now residing in Whittier, California, crossed paths with a local woman named Marie Vogel, sparking a romantic connection between them. Marie, a devoted believer in spiritualism, was a mother to 3 adoptive children, aged 8, 3, and 1. Deeply influenced by her spiritualism, Marie claimed to have visions and firmly believed that a hidden treasure lay beneath their family garage. She confided in George, sharing her visions and urged him to uncover the buried treasure for their benefit. Reluctantly, George succumbed to Marie's insistence and began excavating a hole in search of this elusive treasure. Despite their relationship bearing significant weight, as George affectionately referred to Marie as his wife, their frequent arguments and conflicts continued to escalate. Gertrude Hoffman, Marie's sister, observed the mounting tension during her visit to the couple's farm. Then, one fateful night amid yet another heated argument over whether he would join the army to fight in World War I, George's demeanor suddenly snapped, unleashing a wave of uncontrollable emotions. George suddenly lost his temper with Marie and grabbed a club that lay nearby. He hit her viciously over the head with the club. When Marie fell to the floor, George then wrapped his hands around her neck and squeezed hard. As Marie lay there, unresponsive, he fetched a rope and choked her to death. He then killed all 3 of Marie's children the same way that he had killed their mother, and buried them in the treasure hole that he had dug. The following night, the neighbors became aware of peculiar occurrences taking place at the farm. They observed George crawling beneath the house and discarding dirt and debris. He was seen lugging a weighty trunk and several smaller parcels into the garage. The neighbors reported detecting the foul odor of burning rags emanating from his kitchen for several consecutive days and nights following the family's mysterious disappearance. Upon inquiry regarding Marie and her children's whereabouts, George informed the neighbors that they had relocated to San Francisco. He called Gertrude, Marie's sister, and convinced her that Marie and her children had actually relocated to Australia. At that time, modern communication technology was not available, and it was not easy for Gertrude to confirm where her sister was, so she had no choice but to believe what George had told her. Several years later, George made a decision to revisit the place where he had spent his childhood. His older brother, Thomas, was now in charge of managing the farm alongside his wife, Susan Ferguson, affectionately known as Susie, and their 8 children. During George's visit, the brothers frequently labored together on the farm. Tragically, it was during one of these shared moments in the field that Thomas endured a dreadful accident, losing his life after being kicked by a mule. Farwell authorities were told Thomas's death had at that time been somewhat of a mystery. However, his story of an accident was accepted by his family. After the tragic loss of Thomas, George remained behind to provide assistance to his brother's widow, Susie, in overseeing the crop harvest. Over time, a romantic bond formed between them, despite their stark differences in personality. Susie, a devout Christian who devotedly read her Bible every day, possessed a quiet demeanor that contrasted with George's disposition. Eventually, they decided to marry, and within 6 months, Susie gave birth to a son named Samuel. Susie was his 6th wife. Shortly thereafter, the expanded family relocated to Farwell, situated approximately 60 miles south of Amarillo, where they leased a farm. Their life in Farwell was far from peaceful, and their arguments became more frequent and violent in the 2 years that they lived there. Susie would always side with her children whenever George told them off. This angered George to the point of packing his things and threatening to leave many times, but he never followed through. One evening, George wanted to go to the oil fields once he finished harvesting their crop, with the aim of securing sufficient funds to begin another crop. Susie became increasingly suspicious that George was contemplating setting off and never coming back. Shockingly, in addition to these suspicions, her 13-year-old daughter, Maudie, was showing signs of pregnancy. Susie was convinced that George was having an affair with Maudie, and was responsible for his niece and stepdaughter's pregnancy. On the night of December 5th, he and Susie had argued and she openly confronted him about the affair with Maudie. George walked out and went to the barn where he had a stash of whiskey and drank about a pint as his family slept in the 5-room, wood-framed house. He then returned to the house, where they continued the argument, while baby Sammy slept in the cot next to Susie's bed. George suddenly picked up a hammer that was nearby and hit Susie with it twice, crushing her face and skull. Then he quickly covered her mouth to silence her as the blood from her wounds spurted all over him. He then rummaged for one of Susie's stockings, wrapped it around her neck and choked her. Susie was still barely breathing at this point. George then grabbed an axe and brought it down on her head, killing her instantly. Once he realized what he'd done, he decided that he needed to finish off the rest of the family. George began killing the children, one by one, using a straight razor and stockings to kill them. He started with the youngest, Sammy, who was about 2 years old, and moved on to Nanny Martha, 4, then Johnny, 6, and David, 7. However, upon reaching 11-year-old Russell, the boy regained consciousness and fiercely fought for his life. This commotion woke 15-year-old Virgil, who also engaged in a struggle with George, hitting him several times with a brick. Unfortunately, George managed to get a shotgun and shoot Virgil, killing him instantly. He then went after Russell, who almost escaped, and choked him until he was unconscious. Russell was barely alive and still breathing faintly when George struck him with an axe on the head. He died instantly. His last victim of the night was Maudie, the girl he had been accused of molesting. Once he'd killed everyone, George began digging a root cellar next to the house, his victim's mass grave. George cleaned up all the blood and buried the bodies in the root cellar. Susie's second child, 21-year-old Alton, was working in New Mexico for extra money and was not supposed to come home for another 4 days. When Alton returned, George casually told him that the rest of the family had gone to visit relatives. That night, George prepared dinner for them and the two men played cards late into the night. Once Alton was sound asleep, George crept into his room, put a shotgun barrel against his skull, and pulled the trigger, splattering blood all over the wall. George buried Alton in a mass grave, along with his mother and siblings. Susie's oldest daughter, 24-year-old Nora, was living in California with her husband at the time. Though she had planned to return for the holidays, she had been unexpectedly delayed. This delay ultimately saved her life. Several days later, George organized an auction at the farm, intending to sell off a significant portion of his and his family's belongings. He claimed that he needed to gather funds to join his wife, Susie, and their 8 children in Blair, Oklahoma. However, the auction attracted more than just individuals seeking affordable farming equipment and second-hand clothes. The Hassels' friends and neighbors found themselves both curious and suspicious about the swift departure of Susie and the children. Susie had made no mention of their plans to anyone, or bid farewell before leaving, fueling speculation among those who knew them. During the auction, the Hassels' neighbors couldn't help but grow more suspicious. One family's wagon wheel sank into the soft soil, suggesting recent disturbances on the property. Adding to the intrigue, a crudely constructed root cellar had appeared against one of the house walls, an unusual occurrence just days before vacating the premises. Inside the house, bidders discovered trunks and suitcases brimming with women's and children's clothing. They also stumbled upon Susie's cherished religious books and pamphlets, items she would never willingly part with. The auction concluded with George pocketing a sum of $3,500. Following the sale, the property owner decided to lease the farm to new tenants. George, however, informed them that he needed to tidy up a room before his departure. He stacked suitcases against one wall and scrubbed the floors thoroughly. Unexpectedly, he chose not to leave immediately. The kind-hearted new tenants generously permitted him to extend his stay for a few additional days. Then, on one particular evening after dinner, George complained of feeling unwell and retired to bed early. Mere moments later, he urgently summoned the new tenants, instructing them to fetch both a doctor and the sheriff. When the doctors arrived, they found George in his bed, blood pooling around him. He had 3 self-inflicted stab wounds to his chest and stomach. He had attempted to take his own life. He was swiftly transported to the nearest hospital, where surgeons did their best to mend his severe wounds, stitching him up as effectively as possible. Surprisingly, despite the gravity of his injuries, George appeared to be in good spirits, sharing laughter and banter with the medical staff. Meanwhile, the authorities made an effort to send a telegram to inform Susie about her husband's condition, only to discover that there was no record of a Susie Hassel residing in Blair. This revelation, coupled with the suspicious circumstances surrounding the family's sudden disappearance, prompted the sheriff's office to initiate a search of the Hassels' former residence. Inside the room where George had been engaged in cleaning, law enforcement officers stumbled upon blood spatters on the wall behind the stacked suitcases. This discovery raised alarms among the investigators, leading them to shift their focus to the recently constructed root cellar next to the house. Determined to uncover the truth, they removed the wooden planks and started digging. In that grim search, the law enforcement officials made a horrifying discovery: the buried remains of Susie and her children. The bodies had been meticulously placed in a collective grave, enveloped in blankets and clad in their night attire. Disturbingly, beneath Susie's lifeless form, rested an axe, adding another layer of macabre evidence to the scene. All the victims, except Alton, had stockings tied around their necks. The bodies of all the victims were eventually laid to rest once again in the Farwell Cemetery, requiring the collective effort of all physically capable men from the surrounding area to dig the 9 adjacent graves. Having been discharged from the hospital but still weakened from his injuries, George promptly made a confession, uttering the words, "I did it! I did it!" expressing no remorse, and no particular emotion at all. He gave a detailed confession for killing 13 people, including giving exact locations of where they were buried, but he was only indicted for the murder of Alton. As the jury deliberated, their task was to determine George's mental condition. Consequently, multiple psychiatric experts assessed him and diagnosed him as a sociopath. However, this alone did not meet the criteria for an insanity defense, and he was deemed mentally fit to stand trial. In a remarkably swift decision, the jury rendered their verdict in a mere 30 minutes, finding him guilty. Next, within a span of 2 hours, they reached a sentencing determination: death by electrocution. The man facing execution showed no concern about the verdict and awaited the result of his appeal in a prison located in Huntsville. He confidently stated that the electric chair didn't frighten him any more than a regular barber chair. When questioned about his motives for the killings, George claimed ignorance, stating that he didn't know why he had committed such acts. He gestured towards his head and said, "Something was wrong up here." The deputies were taken aback by his lack of remorse and his insistence that the murders were not premeditated. On February 10, 1928, George was escorted to the electric chair at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. Remarkably, he maintained a serene and smiling demeanor until the very end. In his last statement, Hassel declared, "I would like to announce to the world that I am prepared to meet my God. I have made my confession to God, and man does not understand it all, but God does." It took 3 electrical jolts to end his life, and he was officially declared deceased at 12:29 a.m. His remains were laid to rest in the cemetery of the Huntsville prison. I would like to send my deepest condolences to the families of all the victims. According to his testimony, George Hassel's initial act was motivated by a crime of passion, which resulted in him killing the children in self-defense. Consequently, there arises a question: was George Hassel the most infamous sociopath and family killer of the 20th century? Alternatively, does his extensive criminal history, including murder, embezzlement, and military desertion, suggest a sociopathic nature? Furthermore, was his traumatic and violent upbringing a contributing factor? Share your thoughts and leave a comment below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to our channel for more content.